Bradley Morgan never considered himself a man easily rattled. At 52, he had seen and dealt with enough in life to develop a thick skin. After spending nearly 3 decades working as an architect in the city, he had grown tired of the relentless deadlines, the suffocating urban environment, and the never-ending stream of clients who thought they understood design better than he did. He wanted out, and when the opportunity presented itself, he seized it. A few years ago, he sold his loft, left behind the cold sterility of corporate meetings, and purchased a secluded property in a quiet community nestled around a private pond. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a long overdue transition into a life of peace and self-sufficiency. The property itself was a dream 4 acres of land, with a beautifully designed modern cabin overlooking the pond. The previous owner had kept the place well maintained, but Bradley had bigger plans. He envisioned a perfect retreat, a place where he could finally enjoy the fruits of his labor without the constraints of city life. Over time, he put thousands of dollars into landscaping, reinforcing the shoreline, and installing an advanced water filtration system to keep the pond pristine. He even went as far as introducing a controlled ecosystem by carefully stocking it with rare species of fish, some of which were difficult to acquire and required special permits. It wasn't just a pond, it was his pond, a place that reflected his dedication to craftsmanship, precision, and control. For a while, everything was exactly as he had imagined. Mornings were spent enjoying the view from his deck, sipping coffee while watching the mist rise off the water. Afternoons were for projects adding to the property, fine-tuning details, making improvements. Evenings were quiet, marked by the sounds of cicadas and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. It was the kind of life he had always dreamed of, and for the first time in years he felt in control. That is, until he started noticing strange things. At first it was small. A missing fish here and there, nothing significant, something he chalked up to natural predators or the occasional miscount on his part. But then other details began to nag at him. Bits of discarded fishing line near the shore, cigarette butts where none should be, footprints in the damp earth. It was subtle, but the signs were there someone had been at his pond. Bradley didn't jump to conclusions. He wasn't the kind of man who let paranoia get the best of him. Maybe it was kids sneaking onto the property, or maybe a neighbor had mistaken his pond for public access. He kept an open mind, but he was no fool. He knew how quickly small problems could become big ones, especially in communities like this, where people had lived for decades and developed their own unspoken rules about what belonged to whom. So he did what any rational person would do: he reinforced his boundaries. He installed a clear, well-marked private property sign near the water, making it unmistakable that this was his land. He even placed a small chain across the only footpath leading to the pond, nothing extreme, just enough to make it clear that no one should be wandering through without permission. It wasn't aggressive, just a polite but firm stay-out measure. For a while it seemed to work. The signs remained untouched, and he noticed no new disturbances. He told himself he had overreacted. Maybe it had been a one-time incident, a bored teenager testing their luck. Life returned to its normal, tranquil rhythm. Then, one morning, as he stepped outside to check on the pond, he found something that stopped him cold. His private property, no trespassing sign, had been ripped out of the ground and tossed aside like trash. The chain blocking the pathway had been neatly unclipped and left dangling, as if someone wanted to send a message. Worse still, the water near the shore was disturbed, fish scales glinting in the morning light, and a pile of freshly discarded fish bones was strewn across the rocks. Bradley felt a slow, cold anger settle into his chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a kid playing around or someone making an innocent mistake. This was deliberate. Someone had not only ignored his property line but had actively defied him, going out of their way to remove his signs and act like they had every right to be there. This wasn't about fishing anymore, it was about control. Bradley had spent years designing buildings for clients who thought they could push him around, and who believed that money or entitlement gave them the right to dictate how things should be. He had learned to navigate those power struggles with patience and tact, but this was different. This was his home, his land, his sanctuary. And whoever was doing this wasn't just trespassing. They were challenging him. He wasn't the kind of man to make threats or throw around accusations without proof. He approached problems methodically, strategically. The first step was to gather information. He decided to start by talking to a few locals, getting a feel for whether this was a known issue or if someone in the community had a history of overstepping boundaries. There were old-timers here, people who had been in the area for decades and had likely seen everything. If there was an unspoken rule about access to the pond, he needed to know about it. His first stop was Tom Walker, a 70-year-old retired mechanic who lived a few houses down. Tom had a reputation for knowing everyone's business, though he rarely involved himself unless asked directly. When Bradley mentioned the issue, the old man simply shook his head and muttered, "Ah, yeah, that'd be Karen White." Bradley frowned. "Who's Karen White?" Tom let out a dry chuckle. "A damn nuisance, that's who. Lived here longer than most. Thinks that means she owns more than she does." "You ain't the first to have trouble with her." Bradley absorbed the information, so this wasn't random. This wasn't just some faceless teenager or an accidental misunderstanding. This was a person, a specific person. And from the way Tom spoke about her, she was a problem. As he walked back to his house, Bradley felt the anger in his chest settle into something colder, sharper. He had moved here for peace, for quiet, for control. He had spent years designing spaces where every detail was intentional, every structure built for a purpose. Now someone was trying to dismantle that, and he wasn't going to let that happen. Bradley Morgan didn't believe in overreacting. He had built his entire career on patience, precision, and the ability to analyze situations logically before making decisions. But something about this particular problem gnawed at him in a way that few things ever had. The moment he heard Karen White's name, something inside him sharpened. He hadn't even met her yet, but he could already see the pattern forming. This wasn't just some harmless misunderstanding. This wasn't a one-time intrusion. This was someone who had done this before and had no intention of stopping. The following evening, Bradley walked the perimeter of his property, paying close attention to every possible point of entry. The land around the pond was naturally dense with trees, but there were a few trails that had been worn down over time, probably by previous owners or local wildlife. One of them led directly from the main road to the back of his property, where it met the water. It was clear that whoever had been coming onto his land knew exactly where to go. The chain he had installed was still hanging loosely from its post, unfastened as if someone had made a habit of moving it aside. His sign had disappeared entirely. The only thing left was a freshly crushed cigarette butt pressed into the damp dirt, the faint smell of tobacco still clinging to the air. That was when he heard it. A soft splash, then another. Bradley turned sharply toward the pond, his eyes narrowing in the dimming twilight. At first he thought it was just the usual nighttime activity, the occasional ripple from a fish beneath the surface, or the lazy movement of water against the shore. But then he saw it. A figure standing knee-deep in the pond, a fishing line arched in the air before sinking smoothly into the water. For a moment he simply stared, unable to believe the audacity of it. There, completely at ease as if she had every right to be there, was a woman in a loose-fitting fishing vest, dark jeans rolled up to her knees, and a baseball cap pulled low over her forehead. Even from this distance he could see her smirking. She wasn't sneaking. She wasn't hiding. She was making a statement. Bradley stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "You do realize you're on private property, right?" The woman didn't even flinch. Instead, she reeled in her line, tilting her head as if she were only just noticing him. "Relax, city boy. It's just a pond. I've been fishing here longer than you've owned this place." City boy. The words landed with deliberate condescension. Bradley had dealt with people like her before, people who believed tenure meant ownership. That time spent in a place automatically granted them rights over it. He had no patience for that mindset. That may have been the case before, but it's private land now, and you're trespassing. Karen gave an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head as if he was being unreasonable. You really think you can come in here, put up some fancy signs, and tell me I can't fish in the same damn pond I've been using since I was a kid? Yes, he said flatly. That's exactly what I'm saying. For a brief moment, she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, to his utter disbelief, she simply turned back toward the water and cast her line again. Bradley clenched his jaw, stepping closer. You need to leave. Now. Karen let out a dry laugh. Or what? You gonna call the cops over a fish? He could feel his patience thinning, but he kept his voice level. I don't need to call the cops, but if you come back here again, you'll be trespassing on record. That means legal action. Are you really willing to go that far over some stolen fish? Karen let out a long, dramatic sigh before finally reeling in her line one last time. Jesus, you really are one of those types, huh? She grabbed her tackle box from the shore and slung her fishing rod over her shoulder. Fine. I'm leaving. But don't think this is over. You may have some fancy paperwork saying you own this place, but that doesn't change the fact that this pond has always been part of the community. You're the outsider here, not me. Bradley didn't respond. He simply watched as she trudged up the trail, completely unbothered, as if she had just finished a perfectly normal day of fishing. Once she was gone, he exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. He had expected some pushback, but not this level of sheer defiance. Karen hadn't just ignored his authority, she had mocked it. And that meant she had no intention of stopping. That night he did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down at his desk, pulled out a notepad, and started planning. The next morning he called the local authorities, not to report her, but to ask about the legalities of trespassing enforcement in the area. The answer wasn't exactly reassuring. Unless she physically damaged his property or he had indisputable proof that she was repeatedly trespassing, there was little they could do beyond issuing a warning. Bradley wasn't naive. Warnings meant nothing to people like Karen, so he took matters into his own hands. He reinforced the path with thicker chains and heavy-duty locks. He placed new signs bigger, bolder, with the threat of legal action clearly stated. And just for good measure, he installed a motion-activated light and a simple but effective noise alarm. It wasn't about trapping anyone. It was about sending a message trespassing was no longer an option. For a few days, everything was quiet. No more footprints, no more discarded cigarette butts, no more disturbances near the pond. It almost felt like the problem had solved itself. Until he woke up to find his new sign floating face down in the water, snapped in half. Beside it, on the shore, was a pile of fish heads, deliberately arranged in a neat little row. Bradley stood there for a long time, staring at the grotesque display, feeling something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was a message. Karen wasn't going to stop. She was going to escalate. And now he had to decide exactly how far he was willing to go to put an end to it. Bradley Morgan had dealt with difficult people before. Throughout his years in architecture, he had learned how to handle clients who thought they knew better, city inspectors who changed regulations on a whim, and contractors who tried to cut corners when they thought no one was watching. He was used to standing his ground, calmly and methodically shutting down arguments with logic and preparation. But this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a disagreement over blueprints or zoning laws. This was something else entirely, and it had become clear that Karen White was not just a nuisance. She was testing him, waiting to see how far she could push before he broke. The morning after he found the fish heads lined up on the shore, Bradley took his time cleaning up. He didn't rush, didn't react emotionally. He refused to let Karen dictate his responses. She wanted him rattled. She wanted him to feel threatened. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, bagging up the remains and scrubbing the rocks clean as the early morning mist curled around the water. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He examined the ground around the pond, looking for anything that might give him an idea of how she was getting in. It didn't take long to find the answer. Near the tree line, just past the spot where the old chain had been unhooked, he found fresh footprints in the damp soil. They weren't large women's shoes, no doubt, but they were deep enough to show that whoever had been here had been standing for a while watching. Further along, hidden among the tall reeds near the water's edge, he found something else, a small pile of cigarette butts, the same brand he had seen before, all stubbed out in the dirt. She had been here, waiting, observing. The thought made his stomach tighten. Karen wasn't just coming onto his land, she was treating it as if it were her own. He knew calling the authorities wouldn't get him far, not yet. He had already checked the legal process. If he had caught her in the act, it would have been different, but right now all he had was a vandalized sign and some fish remains. And that wasn't enough to push a trespassing case forward. He needed something more definitive, something that couldn't be ignored. For the time being, he doubled down. The chain wasn't enough, so he replaced it with a heavy-duty steel cable, reinforced with a lock that would require bolt cutters to remove. He installed another motion-activated floodlight, this time with a wider range, ensuring that the entire pathway leading to the pond would be lit up if anyone approached. And then he waited. For 2 nights, nothing happened. On the third night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., he woke to the sudden glare of white light flooding his bedroom window. He moved quickly, slipping out of bed and making his way to the back door. The floodlight had been triggered, but from inside he couldn't see what had set it off. He grabbed a flashlight, stepped outside onto the deck, and scanned the area. At first there was nothing. The water was still, the trees swayed gently in the night breeze, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a shadow shifting near the path, right where the cable had been installed. Karen. She was standing there, her posture stiff, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't carrying a fishing rod this time. Instead, she had bolt cutters in one hand, the metal glinting dully under the floodlight's glow. Bradley didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen lifted her chin, her lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "And you're overreacting. You brought bolt cutters." She gave a casual shrug. "It's a pond, not a goddamn bank vault. You really think you can just lock people out like this?" Bradley took a step forward, not out of intimidation, but to make it clear that he wasn't backing down. "This is my land. I have every right to protect it. You, on the other hand, have exactly zero right to be here." Karen's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked amused. "You keep talking like this is going to go your way. But you don't get it, do you? You think you can just move in and make up new rules? This pond was here before you. We've been fishing here since before you even knew this place existed. You're the outsider. You always will be." Bradley let her talk. He let her dig herself deeper, let her show exactly how far she was willing to push. And then, when she finally went quiet, he tilted his head slightly. "Leave," he said simply. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps crunching against the dirt as she disappeared into the darkness. Bradley didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, he checked the cable. It was still intact, but the padlock had been scratched, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to break it. That was enough for him. He made another call, this time filing an official trespassing complaint. He knew they wouldn't arrest her over it, but now there was a record. Now, if she came back, there would be legal documentation. Later that afternoon, he drove into town to run errands, but as he was pulling back onto his road, he saw something that made his stomach clench. Karen was standing near his driveway, talking to 2 men. They weren't dressed like police, and they didn't look like neighbors. One of them was flipping through a notebook, nodding as Karen spoke, while the other leaned against the hood of a truck, arms crossed. Bradley didn't like it. As he slowed down and pulled into his driveway, All three of them turned to look at him. Karen didn't smile. She just watched. For the first time since this had started, Bradley felt something colder than frustration settle into his chest. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about power. Karen wasn't going to stop. She was going to escalate. And now he had to decide exactly how far he was willing to go to put an end to it. Bradley had spent most of his life believing that logic and preparation could solve nearly any problem. His career had depended on it. He had dealt with last-minute structural failures, city officials changing regulations mid-project, and impossible client demands that required creativity and patience. He had always been able to outmaneuver chaos with planning, to keep himself one step ahead of disaster by anticipating problems before they spiraled out of control. But as he stood in his driveway, watching Karen White speak with the two men, a realization settled over him like cold steel. This wasn't a situation that could be fixed with logic alone. This wasn't a matter of fixing a miscalculation or revising a blueprint. This was something uglier, something personal. The moment she noticed his truck pulling in, Karen fell silent. The two men turned, their eyes sweeping over him in a way that set every nerve in his body on edge. One of them, a wiry man in a faded jacket, had been scribbling something in a notebook. He closed it slowly, slipping it into his pocket like a casual afterthought. The other, taller, broader, wearing a stained baseball cap and boots that had seen years of work, didn't move at all. His posture was relaxed, but Bradley had seen enough in life to recognize quiet intimidation when it was being used deliberately. Bradley stepped out of his truck, shutting the door with deliberate calm. "Something I can help you with?" His voice was even, controlled. Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, just letting the boys here know about our little situation." Bradley let his gaze drift between them. The wiry man shifted his weight slightly, while the taller one scratched at his beard, watching without speaking. "That right?" "Mm-hmm." Karen folded her arms, rocking back slightly on her heels. "Turns out there's a lot of interest in how property lines have been, managed over the years. Some people still remember how things used to be before all these fancy newcomers started putting up fences and chains like they owned the place." Bradley could feel the game she was playing, the deliberate attempt to make him feel like an outsider, to paint herself as the real victim. The local fighting against some entitled city boy who thought he could buy his way into control. It was a carefully curated narrative, and from the way the two men were looking at him, he could tell it wasn't the first time she had sold it. He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well, I suppose if there's any confusion about boundaries, the county clerk's office would be the best place to clear that up. Official records don't tend to care much about traditions." The taller man finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "Yeah, except sometimes records don't tell the whole story. Sometimes folks just take what they want 'cause they got money to do it. Doesn't make it right." Bradley met his gaze, unflinching. "No, it doesn't." The silence stretched between them. Karen was watching closely, waiting for any sign of hesitation. When she didn't get it, she let out a breathy laugh. "Oh, relax, Bradley. No one's here to start trouble. We're just talking. Having a friendly chat." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned, walked up the steps of his porch, and went inside, closing the door behind him with a controlled, deliberate movement. He refused to give them the reaction they wanted, but he wasn't naive. He moved to the window, watching as Karen and the two men stood there for another minute, still talking. Then, finally, they climbed into their truck and drove off. Karen lingered a little longer, standing by the road, staring at the house like she was considering her next move. Then she followed, disappearing down the dirt road. Bradley didn't like this. Not one bit. That night, he took extra precautions. He checked all the locks, reinforced the back gate, and made sure the security lights were fully functional. But something gnawed at him, a sense of unease that wouldn't settle. This wasn't just about the pond anymore. It hadn't been for a while. This was about power. Karen wasn't just trying to fish, she was trying to win. and winning for her meant making sure he lost. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, Bradley walked out to check the pond. He didn't expect anything new, but the moment he reached the shore, his stomach tightened. The water was different. Off. A faint, murky film had spread across the surface, something unnatural, something that hadn't been there before. He crouched down, scooping up a handful, rubbing the liquid between his fingers. It was slightly slick, a faint chemical odor clinging to it. Then he saw the fish. At first it was just one or two, floating near the reeds, belly up. Then he saw more, further out, dozens. Some were already being picked apart by scavengers, others still barely moving, their bodies twitching weakly before going still. A slow, controlled fury rose in his chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't nature. Someone had poisoned his pond. Bradley clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. He knew exactly who was responsible. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't Karen trying to be clever. This was a direct, calculated attack, and it had just become criminal. Within the hour, he was making phone calls. Not to the local police, they had already been dismissive about the trespassing. No, this required a different approach. He called the state environmental agency. Poisoning a body of water wasn't just vandalism. It was a felony. By the time the inspector arrived that afternoon, Bradley had already gathered samples, making sure nothing got washed away. The man took one look at the pond, at the dead fish, at the unnatural film clinging to the shoreline, and his expression darkened. "Yeah," he muttered, pulling on a pair of gloves. "This isn't runoff or natural contamination. Someone put something in here, and depending on what it is, they're looking at serious charges." Bradley nodded. "I know exactly who did it." The inspector glanced up. "You have proof?" Bradley exhaled. That was the problem. He knew it was Karen, but unless she had been seen doing it, unless there was something to physically tie her to the act, it would be her word against his. But he wasn't going to let her get away with this. "Not yet," he said, voice cold, "but I will." That night, as he stood by his window, watching the darkness beyond the trees, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about defending his property anymore. This was a war, and he wasn't going to lose. Bradley Morgan had always been a patient man. He had built his career on the ability to stay calm under pressure, to handle crises with measured precision, and to outthink obstacles rather than react impulsively. But as he stood at the edge of his pond, staring at the water that had once been a pristine sanctuary and was now a murky graveyard for dozens of his fish, he felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Karen White had stopped playing games. She had crossed a line. The state environmental agency had taken their samples, confirming what Bradley already knew: this wasn't a natural occurrence. The water had been deliberately contaminated. The lab results weren't back yet, but the inspector had warned him that if this was something toxic enough to kill the fish so quickly, it could have lasting effects on the ecosystem. That meant more than just environmental fines. That meant criminal charges. But Karen wasn't stupid. She wasn't going to walk into a police station and confess. She was going to do exactly what she had been doing all along, playing the long game, twisting the narrative, making herself the victim while she chipped away at him from the shadows. "Did come on in?" There, Bradley wasn't going to let that happen. The first thing he did was take additional precautions. He had already installed security lights, reinforced his property line, and reported every incident. But now it was time to force her into the open. He called a wildlife conservation officer, requesting an official investigation into the poisoning of a protected body of water. Unlike local law enforcement, they took these matters seriously. And unlike the police, they had the authority to enforce environmental regulations without needing a direct witness. That was the first step. The second step came the next evening, when Bradley made a point to be outside, visible, as he cleaned up the remains of what had once been his thriving ecosystem. He wasn't just picking up fish, he was making a statement, and Karen saw it. He knew she did, because just as the sun was setting, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He didn't turn immediately, didn't acknowledge her right away. He made her wait, made her feel the weight of his silence as he finished what he was doing before finally looking up. Karen was standing near the edge of his property, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But there was something in her stance that had shifted. She wasn't smirking this time. "You're really making a big deal out of this, huh?" Her voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, a tightness that hadn't been there before. Bradley straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You mean the felony-level crime?" "Yeah, I'd say it's a big deal." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't have proof." "Not yet." A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance. Maybe even concern. "This pond isn't just yours, you know. People have been using it for years. You're acting like you own nature." "I own my land," he corrected. "And I sure as hell own the fish I paid for." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you? You're not one of us. You never will be. No one wants you here." Bradley let the words sit between them for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Good." Her eyes flickered with something he hadn't seen before, uncertainty. She had expected him to argue, to get defensive, to try and justify his presence in the community. Instead, he had given her nothing to work with. She hated that. He saw the frustration in the way her fingers curled at her sides before she turned sharply and walked back to her truck, slamming the door harder than necessary before peeling out onto the road. Bradley watched her go, exhaling slowly. He knew what was coming next. She wasn't going to stop. She was going to double down. And she did. That night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., his motion sensors triggered. Bradley was already awake. He had been expecting something, and when the floodlights flared to life, he was out of bed in seconds, moving with quiet precision as he grabbed the flashlight he had left by the door. This time she wasn't alone. There were two figures standing near the pond. One of them he recognized immediately, Karen. The other was taller, broader, a man whose face was obscured by the shadows. They weren't fishing. They were carrying something. Bradley's stomach tightened. He stepped out onto the deck, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, landing squarely on them. "Put it down." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. Karen tensed. The man beside her turned slightly, and for the first time Bradley saw what they had been hauling: a plastic container, industrial grade, the kind used for chemicals. His blood went ice cold. Karen recovered quickly, forcing a smirk. "You're really obsessed with this pond, huh?" Bradley took a slow step forward. "I won't say it again." "Put it down." The man hesitated. He wasn't like Karen. He wasn't as invested in the game she was playing. Bradley could see it in his stance, the way he shifted slightly, uncertainty creeping in. "He's bluffing," Karen muttered. "He's not going to do anything." She was wrong. Bradley reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and raising it deliberately, making sure they saw the screen. "You've got about 5 seconds before this goes directly to the Wildlife Enforcement Division. And trust me, poisoning water isn't something they take lightly. You won't just get a fine, you'll get federal charges." The man swore under his breath. He turned sharply, dropping the container without a second thought. It hit the ground with a dull thud. Karen's expression hardened, cowered, but her accomplice wasn't listening anymore. He was already moving, already leaving, disappearing into the darkness with hurried steps. Karen was alone now. Bradley took another step forward. "You want to explain what was in that?" Her jaw tightened. "You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you?" "No," he said. "I just think I'm smarter than you." For the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her pace quick, shoulders tense. Bradley didn't stop her. He didn't need to. Because the next morning, the conservation officer returned. And when they tested the contents of that container, Karen White's game was finally over. Bradley didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch, staring out at the pond, the remnants of Karen's attempted sabotage still sitting where her accomplice had dropped them. The plastic container, now sealed in an evidence bag, had been collected by the conservation officer that morning. Its contents confirmed as a highly toxic pesticide banned in most states due to its lethal effects on aquatic ecosystems. The officer hadn't even bothered to hide his reaction. This wasn't just a case of someone being careless. This was premeditated destruction, an intentional act meant to wipe out what was left of the pond's carefully balanced ecosystem. And that meant serious consequences. Bradley knew Karen was running out of options. She had tried everything: intimidation, legal loopholes, direct confrontation, and now environmental terrorism, and none of it had worked. She had spent weeks trying to drive him out, trying to make him break, and instead she was the one who had finally made a mistake. Now it was only a matter of time before she faced real consequences. But that didn't mean she was done. Bradley knew people like her, people who hated losing more than they feared punishment, people who would rather burn everything to the ground than admit they had been beaten. And if there was one thing he had learned throughout this entire ordeal, it was that Karen White was the kind of person who would rather go out swinging than surrender quietly. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bradley stepped outside, instinctively scanning the tree line. The air was still, thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth clinging to his skin. His security lights flickered on as he moved toward the water, checking the shoreline for any new signs of disturbance. He had expected retaliation. He had braced himself for it. But he hadn't expected this. The first thing he noticed was the fire. It wasn't large, not yet, just a flicker of orange near the far end of the property, close enough to the tree line to make his stomach drop. It spread quickly, the dry grass catching faster than he had anticipated. For half a second, he was frozen, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the base of the trees, climbing higher, fueled by whatever accelerant had been used to set them. And then he was moving. Bradley sprinted toward the fire, heart hammering, adrenaline cutting through the shock. He grabbed the nearest bucket, filling it from the pond and throwing the water over the flames, but it barely made a dent. The fire was spreading too fast. That was when he heard it. Laughter. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was there. He turned sharply, his breath coming fast, his eyes scanning the darkness. And then he saw her. Karen stood just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, smiling. She didn't run. She didn't even look remotely concerned. You should have left when you had the chance. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. Bradley didn't waste time arguing. He turned and ran back toward the house, grabbing the fire extinguisher he kept in the garage. By the time he got back, the flames had spread further, the dry summer air feeding the fire, sending smoke curling into the sky. He worked quickly, methodically, spraying the base of the fire until the flames began to choke and die, leaving behind a smoldering blackened patch of earth. When he turned back, Karen was gone. His hands were still shaking when he pulled out his phone and dialed. This time he wasn't calling conservation. He wasn't filing another report. This time it was arson, and the fire department wasn't the only authority that would be getting involved. By the time the police arrived, the fire was out, but the damage had been done. The officers took one look at the charred ground, the empty container of accelerant half hidden in the brush, and the security footage Bradley had managed to pull up from the motion-activated cameras. Karen had finally gone too far. She wasn't there when they went to question her. Her truck was gone, her house dark, but that didn't matter. Bradley knew she couldn't run from this. The evidence was damning. 2 hours later, they found her. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't even trying to avoid them. She was at the local bar, drinking like she didn't have a care in the world. The officers didn't say much when they approached her, didn't waste time asking for explanations. They didn't need them. Karen didn't fight. She didn't resist. She just sat there, staring at the bottom of her glass, before finally letting out a slow breath. Took you long enough. Bradley wasn't there when they cuffed her, wasn't there to see the moment she realized it was over. But when his phone buzzed with a notification from one of the officers, an official update on the case, confirming her arrest for arson, environmental destruction, and multiple counts of trespassing, he let out a slow breath, and finally, for the first time in weeks, felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. It was over. Karen White had spent weeks trying to take everything from him. She had lied, manipulated, threatened, and destroyed. She had tried to erase his claim to the land, to break him down piece by piece, to make him feel powerless. But in the end, she had lost. She had done this to herself. Bradley walked back toward the pond, the air still heavy with the lingering scent of smoke. The water was dark, reflecting the night sky, and for the first time in a long time it felt like his again. He wasn't naive. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to challenge his right to this place. There would always be people like Karen, people who thought time and familiarity meant ownership, people who refused to accept that things had changed. But next time he wouldn't hesitate. Next time he would be ready. And next time whoever tried to take what was his wouldn't get nearly as far as Karen White did. In the days following Karen White's arrest, the silence around Bradley's property felt almost unnatural. It wasn't just the absence of her presence, it was the absence of the tension that had hung over him for weeks, the constant expectation of the next escalation, the next invasion, the next fight. Now, for the first time since this all began, there was nothing. No footprints near the pond, no torn-down signs, no disturbances in the water, just quiet. But it wasn't over yet. Karen had been charged with multiple offenses: arson, criminal trespassing, environmental destruction, and attempted vandalism. The evidence against her was overwhelming: security footage, chemical reports, witness statements, and the accelerant container left behind at the scene. There was no way to explain it away, no loophole she could manipulate to escape consequences this time. And yet, she still tried. Her lawyer, a man who looked as exhausted as he did resigned, argued that the fire had been an accident, that Karen had simply been out for a walk when she noticed the flames and had panicked, running away instead of calling for help. It was a weak defense, and the prosecutor tore it apart within minutes. The security footage alone showed her standing near the flames, watching them spread, making no effort to stop it. Bradley didn't attend the trial. He didn't need to. The case was open and shut. He followed the updates from a distance, waiting for the inevitable verdict. And when it finally came, there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Karen White was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Not a slap on the wrist. Not probation. Real time behind bars. For Bradley, it should have been the moment of closure, the point where he could finally let go of everything that had happened. But as he stood on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the trees, he realized something. He didn't feel relief. He felt exhaustion, because winning didn't erase the damage that had been done. The pond was still recovering. The wildlife conservation team had done their best to cleanse the water, to reverse the effects of the poisoning, but some of the fish populations had been completely wiped out. The ones that survived were sluggish, their movements dulled by the lingering traces of chemicals still in the ecosystem. It would take years to restore the balance he had spent so much time creating. And then there was the fire. The blackened earth near the tree line was a scar on his land, a reminder of how far Karen had been willing to go to prove a point. He had already started the process of restoring it, replanting sections of the damaged area, but it would never look the same. Not entirely. There would always be traces of what had happened here. People in the town still talked about it. Even though most of them had kept their distance while the feud was happening, there was no ignoring it now. The crazy woman who tried to burn her neighbor out over a pond was a story too wild to keep quiet. Some avoided Bradley altogether, uncomfortable with the knowledge that they had, at some point, entertained Karen's side of the story. Others were suddenly too friendly, acting as if they had supported him all along. Bradley didn't care. He hadn't moved here to make friends. One afternoon, a few weeks after Karen's sentencing, he got an unexpected visitor. Tom Walker, the old mechanic who had first told him about Karen, pulled up in his rusted-out pickup, stepping out with the stiff movements of someone who had spent too many years working with his hands. He leaned against the side of his truck, squinting toward the pond. "Heard they finally put her away," he muttered. Bradley nodded. "Yeah," Tom exhaled, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "Never thought I'd see the day. She always had a way of slipping through cracks. Guess she finally pushed too far." Bradley didn't respond. Tom glanced at him, studying his face for a long moment before finally speaking again. "You sticking around?" It was a fair question. After everything that had happened, most people would have considered moving. The idea had crossed Bradley's mind once or twice, especially in the immediate aftermath of the fire. But in the end, he always came to the same conclusion. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Tom nodded slowly. "Figured as much. You don't seem like the type to run." He didn't stay long after that, just gave Bradley a short nod, climbed back into his truck, and drove off, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of motor oil in the air. Bradley watched him go, then turned back toward the water. The pond was still. The reflections of the trees rippled across the surface, broken only by the occasional flicker of movement beneath. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was his. And that was enough.